He's ruined Christmas. He let the Muslims in. I know, Christmas? He ruined Christmas. He let the Muslims in. We can't say that word. We've got to be ashamed of everything, and we're not ashamed people. We're a proud people, and we're going to take our country back, so watch out, Obama, we're coming. That's an actual quote. And indeed, white voters are losing their influence. One reason that President Obama did well in 2012 was that Black and Latino voters, who were his strongest supporters, comprised 29% of the electorate. In this election, almost 1 in 3 eligible voters is projected to be a member of a minority group. At least 44% of the Latino electorate is a millennial now, with 800,000 new eligible voters turning 18 every single year. And as those numbers shift, relations between the two races are eroding. In 2008, 70% of whites believed that the relationship between blacks and whites was relatively good, according to Gallup. By last year, that number had fallen to 45%. And polls show a majority of white people are angrier this election year than ever before. In an NBC News SurveyMonkey Esquire online poll, 54% of whites said that they are angrier now than 1 year ago. 73% of Republican white voters said they are angry every single day. Republican candidate Donald Trump said, "I am representing a lot of anger out there." And that anger is not just limited to healthcare, gun control, or the economy. Nearly 20% of Donald Trump supporters did not approve of freeing the slaves, according to a poll back in January, YouGov, the Economist poll. Public policy polling found support for flying the Confederate flag among 70% of Donald Trump supporters. 38% said they regretted the South had lost the Civil War. A CNN ORC poll found that 29% of Americans still believe that President Obama is Muslim, 54% if you looked specifically at Trump supporters. Words like Mexican and Muslim have become proxies, I think, for the black versus white racism that may still be too bald-faced for some. Voices that want to build a wall to separate us from drug-dealing rapist Mexicans hide behind the immigration debate, and those who favor the internment or banishment of Muslims say, well, actually, we're talking about the war on terror. The president himself rarely acknowledges that race played a role in the election, much less that it might inform the aftermath. But when an NPR reporter asked the president what he thinks is, quote, bothering people, the president said this: "If you're referring to specific strains in the Republican Party that suggest I'm different, I'm Muslim, I'm disloyal, what I'd say is that's pretty specific to me and who I am and my background, and that in some ways I may represent change that worries them." And maybe that's why they also shy away from talking about, for example, hashtag Black Lives Matter or any other racial issue that provoked anger among blacks over the last 8 years. Donald Trump has had Black Lives Matter protesters ejected from the rallies, saying that actually we should embracing a hashtag All Lives Matter, which effectively removes a conversation about race from black people into white people. And yet, for all of that, the story about being black in America could also be as simple as the story of Pharrell Williams, a working class kid from Virginia Beach who made $22 million on a song called Happy that people tripped over themselves to download. Or the story of 71% of black Americans who say their standard of living is on the rise compared to 46% of white. Indeed, it is startling that African Americans who had less to begin with, slaves obviously don't have possessions, they were possessions, slavery went away, segregation made it hard to acquire things of great value, discrimination also. Certainly there are white people whose families have a long history of struggle. There are white people who didn't have slaves or didn't have plantations. There are white people who immigrated to this country with absolutely nothing. But in examining the progress they made, you can see where race itself was a benefit. Being white was an advantage. Is black optimism, certainly in the area of economics, justified? According to one study, blacks would have to save their entire income for 3 years to close the wealth gap just using their own savings. And you should note, blacks and whites save at the same rates. So, though blacks are behind economically, there are ways, really substantive ways, I think, that African Americans are gaining ground. If you look at politics, which I think we could agree is one area where there's been a number of attacks, black voting rates now surpass white voting rates. In 2008, when the first black president ran for office, 66.2% of blacks voted, compared to 64.1% of whites. And it wasn't the first time. It was, at that time, the first time that black voting had outpaced white voting. But by the next election in 2012, when there was already a sitting black president in the White House, black voters, again, turned out in greater numbers, 13% of an electorate, where they're 12% of the population. Black voting has not been discouraged in some areas by restrictive laws and ID requirements. Highest voter turnouts when compared to white voters were in states that chose those elections to impose new restrictions: Missouri, Tennessee, Georgia, Indiana, Virginia, Arkansas, Texas, and Kansas. Black Americans turned a debate over voting restrictions into a demonstration of voting participation. And voting participation ultimately is what got them the first black president and a black female attorney general, who now stands as a symbol of what could be gained as we move toward racial equality. And that's what she had to say. That very thing, in fact, when she announced the lawsuit that I started this conversation with. It was not so long ago, she said, that states, including North Carolina, had signs above restrooms, water fountains, and on public accommodations to keep people out based on a distinction without a difference. We have moved beyond those dark days, but not without pain and suffering and an ongoing fight to keep it moving forward. In that fight to move forward, I would enlist you to embrace civil rights in its broadest definition, to speak out against fear and racism, to leverage the progress of the past decade and more, to promote racial equality even further, and help us move past these dark days with purpose. How do you move past dark days when it feels like we're constantly circling back to them? How do we talk about dark days and make progress? Our next panel, which I'll moderate, will do just that. We will be focusing on Detroit in the summer of 1967. How do you look backward to move forward? Let's start with a video.
When I first came to Detroit, we still had about 1.3 million people in the city. The automotive industry was still very strong. There were a lot of good neighborhoods in the city.
I knew all the store owners on Livernois because as a kid, I had grown up with these people.
It was looked at as one of the great cities.
The United States Olympic Committee has chosen Detroit, Michigan as its nominee for the 1968 Olympic Games.
Detroit was a city that had a lot of growth. Obviously, it had a lot of problems.
People were angry, people were frustrated.
A city cannot have a compartment of haves and have-nots and expect the have-nots to be forever contented.
As Governor of the state of Michigan, I do hereby officially request the immediate deployment of federal troops into Michigan.
We said it couldn't happen, but it did, and the nation was shocked.
I don't know who to blame. It's really off.
I was stunned because my whole childhood was burning.
There's a lot of myths that have kind of built up around 1967.
It was a time of taking back.
I think largely it was a race riot.
We didn't look at it as a race riot.
It kind of separated the whites from the blacks.
It was a response to the police.
It was a reflection of hopelessness.
Was it a race riot? Was it an uprising? Was it a civil unrest?
We need to know what our history has been.
If we look at history, we won't make those same mistakes again.
Detroit 67, looking back to move forward, it's all about how you bring a diverse community together around the historic effects of a crisis.
We want people to come away with better understanding the events that led up to 1967.
Everyone has their own perspective, and how do we begin to understand those perspectives?
We have to create a space of dialogue where we tell our stories and that we acknowledge each other's truth.
If people are going to really come together, if we're really going to take away the division, we have to have a baseline of understanding.
People need to feel a part of it, and they need to feel like they have the opportunity to be engaged in what's taking place in their city.
The story clearly has national significance. Detroit is a classroom, and everyone's watching.
I mean, the biggest takeaway would be action. I want people reflecting on A, what can they do to make a difference, how they can get involved, and then to come back and do something about it.